welcome back to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy. If you like the podcast, you have something to say to me, you have thoughts, concerns, whatever, please feel free to write to me. My email is Eitan, E-I-T-A-N, Eitan at rabbieitan.com, RABBIEITAN.com. Feel free to write to me. And thank you, everybody who downloaded and commented on the last podcast. It's heartening, and it makes me want to go ahead and keep doing this. So please share the podcast with people. If you're not subscribed, get subscribed. Leave a review on iTunes, whatever you can do to help me get it out there, and I will really, really appreciate it. Now, on with the show. So this morning I uploaded a video from, it's called Prager University, whatever, it's Dennis Prager. He's this conservative talk show host, but he puts out these videos, and it was basically a statement by this British Muslim fellow who, grew up in England, and he talked about sort of his journey, how he grew up being taught that Jews were evil and Israel was evil, and therefore Jews were evil, and therefore the West was evil because they supported the Jews, / Israel, whatever. And throughout the video, eventually he sort of comes around. He reads the book by Alan Dershowitz, The Case for Israel. He comes and visits. He finds out, it's not really so bad, blah, 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 right? So I wrote this post when I put it up on my Facebook page, and I want to just basically read it to you because there's a problem in it that I anticipated some of my more left-leaning friends were going to read. And if this doesn't apply to you, wonderful. If it does, listen up. I'm being honest here. If it doesn't, listen, and this is information that you can use when you're talking to people who are sort of strongly anti-Israel. So here's the story. Here's what I wrote. If you're not Jewish and or not a strong Israel supporter and you bother to watch this, I assume there will be a strong objection that comes up. He keeps confusing hatred of Israel and hatred of Jews. Yes, welcome to the problem. All over the world, broadcasts in Arabic and to other Muslim communities use the words Zionist and Jew interchangeably. Some argue that the demonizing of Israel uniquely and disproportionately for crimes which are minor compared to the regular, publicly lauded behavior of our enemy countries, and not countries, I guess, and the sheer scale of that demonization, with more UN resolutions passed against Israel than every other nation in the world combined. Hello? Syria, Russia, China, Iran? Can only be explained by the application of Jew hatred, otherwise known as anti-Semitism, to Israel as a state. But the West supports Israel, you might say. Well, it also supports Saudi Arabia. But whereas Israel is locked in a nasty, unpleasant geopolitical conflict within its contested and still undefined borders, wherein Israel protects the basic rights of the minority that lives there, the Palestinians, imperfectly, but still, and they're still living under a largely autonomous, self-governing area, and the rest of the country gives full civil and political rights to all citizens and operates as a modern liberal democracy. Saudi Arabia also enjoys U.S. largesse, fighter jets, etc., while it outlaws, that is Saudi Arabia, outlaws homosexuality, women driving, or leaving the home without a male escort, enforces heresy laws with imprisonment and worse as the consequence, etc., etc. Right? Another example, the U.S.'s largest trading partner is China, which has been occupying whole nations, including Tibet, notably, for over half a century. And the accusations that would make Israel worse than those countries, or in fact anywhere near as bad as them, are just completely false. See the accusation of genocide, which is ridiculous because their population has more than doubled in the last 20 years. As individuals, anybody can say they have to pick their issues to fight against, right? That's what people say to me when I bring up this challenge usually. They say, well, this is an issue I'm particularly concerned with, so that's why I focus on it. And that's true, we all have to do that. But when the whole world picks the same one issue, not the worst issue, continuously over years and years, and that one issue happens to be the country of the Jews, that's anti-Semitism, Jew hatred. If you believe in this idea of structural racism, then you should believe in structural anti-Semitism. So don't be a part of it. Now, that's what I had to say about that post. And I also have something else I want to say, which is there's a lot of American Jews who have been sending me comments about what they think Israel should do. And I'm open to that. You're welcome to. And I'm interested to hear what you think, and I'd like to talk to you about it. But I have to say there is a sort of a tone of sort of imperioususness from what I would consider left of center American Jews. And at the same time, a lot of the same people, when I ask them, well, how can you vote for this guy or that guy, or how can you support, for instance, Keith Ellison? It's like, well, Israel's just not the only thing they care about, and that's fine. But I have to say, if Israel's welfare isn't a political priority for you, you shouldn't really expect that your opinion is going to be a political priority for us in Israel. That's the quid pro quo here. So, again, thank you everyone for your support. However it comes, whatever it looks like. And please, God, the world should come to its senses soon.
Sinners say your presence train is off the tracks. Nothing is forever when tomorrow's calling. Dancing with the devil to get one day back. Not afraid of burning bridges, 'cause I know they're gonna light my way. Like a phoenix from the ashes. Welcome to the future, it's a new day. We don't run. I'm standing.
Hey, so now a few words about the fires. I know this is old news. It's like a week and a half ago already, which in Israel means it's approximately 3,000 news cycles ago. Really, seriously, if you go on Israeli websites and you haven't checked the news in the last 3-4 hours, the big thing that happened this morning it's off the front page. You got to go look through the archives to figure out what happened if you go offline for a few hours. But the fires happened last week. They were a big deal. The police are now saying that maybe about half of them were started by arsonists, and that includes the ones that caused the most damage, including destroying homes in Haifa. So, and which also caused the evacuation of 70,000 plus people. There was this string of articles that I saw, sort of having to do with the fires, that talked about how the PA had sent firefighters to help fight the fires, and the PA had made these statements, this isn't good, you should stop doing it, to the arsonists if you're doing it, which they denied they were doing it, but then at the same time they said that they shouldn't do it if they were doing it. Anyway, that this is destroying Palestinian land also, and that's nice, but this appeared to me to be a bit of a false narrative about what was going on, because this was not calls to peaceful coexistence. The PA propaganda machine in Arabic, in the territories that they're in control of, in the school systems where they teach, put out propaganda all day, every day about martyring yourself and killing Jews being a praiseworthy and wonderful thing for people to want to grow up to do. And we've seen in the last year, this sort of quote-unquote knife intifada, where with all the killings, that when these knifings would happen in general, the PA would not decry the stabbers, they would decry the Israeli soldiers who shot the stabbers before they could stab more people. Because, after all, you should have shot him in the leg, or you should have detained him some other way, or it's all just a Zionist conspiracy and he wasn't really a stabber anyway, they just killed this random Palestinian. Because that's what they teach, right? In their propaganda, they basically think that I, a settler, am driving around in my, on the back of a truck like an ISIS guy, just shooting Palestinians for sport, right? They don't, not that I'm like, living in a house and driving a car and going to work every day, but like that I'm just going out and trying to kill and make life miserable for Palestinians as much as possible. So that's the propaganda they put out, and we shouldn't be surprised then. If that's what I am, right, in their eyes, then obviously fighting me would make sense, right? It's only the right thing to do. But the propaganda is ridiculous. And this this issue where they're helping us fight the fires. It's like, well, yeah, we do have some basic common interests. We both have an interest in not having the country burned down because we both live in it. Arabs, Jews, Palestinians, Israelis, we all live in the same piece of land, and things which affect the entire land affect both of us, like fires. It's bad. And this land that they want to kill us and kick us off of, they want it to be nice and have trees on it, trees which we planted, but whatever. Leave that aside. So this is not a sign of coexistence. This is not a sign of a turn towards peace. This is not really anything even very good. And in fact, having spoken to some Israeli firefighters, it wasn't really very helpful either, because the Palestinians had a few fire trucks, but they're not well trained. Their equipment's not in good shape. They weren't really that helpful, but it was a good symbolic gesture. I'm not saying they shouldn't have sent them, but it seems like the news has sort of glommed onto this one ray of hope. And don't be deceived, things are exactly the same as they were. In fact, maybe worse following the fires. So again, it's sort of it's narrative warfare. What's the story people are telling themselves and each other about what happened here? And it's very nice that the Palestinian Authority has decried starting fires, but in terms of killing people, that they really haven't spoken up against. So I would rather have the situation reversed, quite honestly, if those are our choices. Last week, there was a tragedy here in Tekoa, the town where I live. It's a small town. We've got a few thousand people here, 2,000-3,000, something like that. And, we all kind of vaguely know each other, at least, even if we're not all close to each other. And in the evening, soon after dark, Chen Yisrael Bloch, his name is Chen, which means grace in English. He was riding his bike, and he drove by sort of our main traffic circle. We don't have we're not even a one light town. We're a one traffic circle town. No stoplights. He was wearing a helmet. He was crossing at the crosswalk, and a army jeep, well, not army, border police, but it's functions like the army, was driving up and was not speeding. And as far as we can tell, the driver was not doing anything wrong. And he collided with Chen on his bicycle, and Chen was killed. So, in Baruch Dayan Hamet, in Jewish tradition, the funerals are quick. So the next day was the funeral, and people gave some really beautiful eulogies for Chen. But one thing that his mother said that really spoke to me, given sort of the facts of the case, which I guess I didn't even know yet at the time, but she did, was she says that this is a way of God teaching us that we can't keep our children safe, no matter what. In other words, that it's up to God. It's not really up to us. And I really feel like so much of what goes on in life is teaching us this lesson. All we can do is put our best effort in. We can try to be safe. We can try to protect our children. We should, right? Obviously. I'm not saying don't put on your seatbelt because, whatever. We need to do those things. But really, ultimately, finally, the result that's going to come from those actions is decided by someone else. It's decided by God. It's not up to us. And I was thinking about this sort of as the fires were ending also. And, maybe this, in Israel, we've had this sort of idea recently, now that we have all this desalination, that, we're not really worried about the rain anymore. And which is funny because it says specifically in our rabbinic sources, why did God give this land, quote unquote, flowing with milk and honey? Why is it a land which flows with milk and honey some years and not others? It's a land which is dependent on rainfall highly dependent on rainfall, the specific amount of rainfall that happens that year, and happening in the right time and in the right amounts, as opposed to somewhere like Egypt, where basically the Nile floods every year. Come rain or shine, every year reliably the Nile floods and people have water. So our sources say that, the rabbis say, that this is because God wants us to recognize that we're dependent on him and pray to him, and recognize that it really all comes from him. Obviously, it really all comes from him in Egypt also, but it's harder to see it. And here, we Jews, being a little stiff-necked, right? We need a little extra reminder to keep us on the straight and narrow. So, we had this, I'm not saying this is cause and effect, I'm just talking about what lessons we can learn. It feels like we got a little cocky about our lack of need for rain. We've defeated the drought with technology, is the crowing that we've heard on all our media here. And it's true, in terms of us having enough water to drink, we've basically defeated the drought. Not quite yet, because, we still use water from the Kinneret, from the Sea of Galilee, and from the aquifer up here in the hills for half, at least, of our drinking water. But again, in a few years, we may not need that anymore. Nonetheless, even if we don't need a drop of water to drink, we still need it for agriculture. We still need it to keep, as we're seeing now, we need it to keep the hills nice and moist. We need it to keep the plants alive. We need it to keep the plants, the grass, the shrubs, everything living that holds the soil in place and prevents our country from becoming a dust bowl, a giant bowl of dust that's basically miserable and unlivable. So we rely on God, and this is still a way that is apparent. The truth is, we rely on God for everything. We rely on God for, shipments of oil or coal, I think, that fuel our power plants, that desalinate the water. We rely on all of these supply chains working right, on the captain of the ship not having a heart attack at the wrong moment and running into the dock, on no major earthquake causing damage in infrastructure that may have that we don't know, not been built as well as it should have, or being so strong that it destroys it anyway. We rely on God for everything, all the time, for the energy of the sun continuing to come down on us, for our heart beating every moment. I picture, there's this saying, Hamachadish betuva b'kol yom tamid maseh bereshit, that God creates anew in every moment the work of creation. And I always have this sort of picture of almost, sorry if this version of this grosses you out, but I always have this sort of vision of like a hand palpitating someone's heart, like a surgeon. When CPR doesn't work, sometimes a surgeon, they'll crack open someone's chest, they'll stick their hand in there, and they'll literally squeeze the person's heart directly with their hand, rhythmically, to try to get it to start pumping again. I sort of picture God's hand in there, giving my heart the power to pump every time, giving the little, sparking the electric shock that gets things going, or squeezing it to make the blood pump. And that's the truth. No matter how much we understand about what's going on, ultimately, whatever degree of cause we understand, there's always a cause behind it. There's always possibilities that we don't foresee. And all of those things are things out of our control. Even the actions of other human beings, including the actions of other human beings, and whether they're allowed to be carried out, whether they will come to fruition, whether they will affect us personally, whether they'll get stopped at that light, 3 blocks before, so that they don't get to the point where they're going to run into us if they're not paying attention. So these are all deep and hard things, and it's important, particularly important, I think, in these days when everything in the world seems so uncertain, and we're all hoping for the best and planning for the worst, that we're also praying for the best and hoping, talking to God. Because ultimately, at least in the Jewish tradition, that's one of the major purposes of these trials, is to get us to talk to God, to get us to recognize that we're not in charge. It's not necessarily punishment. its teaching moment, right? So please God, we should all learn our lessons, and we should immediately be able to move past these trials to better times. All right. Now, in our last little section here of this week's podcast, we're going to talk about the Parsha. Now, this week's Parsha, first maybe I should explain. I haven't really done this section in a while. The Parsha is the section of the weekly Torah, the Torah portion that we read in the synagogue that week on 2 days during the week, and then on Shabbat we read the whole thing out loud in front of the congregation. This week's Parsha is Vayetze. The Parshas are named after usually the first word, or if not one of the first words the Parsha won't be named the, right? It'll be the cow, or the going out, or the whatever, right? So the first meaningful, contentful word of the Parsha usually is the name of it, and it's broken up into sections so that we can read one every week and come back around to the beginning once a year. This week's Parsha we pick up after the story where Jacob has essentially tricked his father Yitzchak, Isaac, into giving him the blessing, passing on the covenant between his father Abraham and God on to Jacob and not to Esau. Right? There's some confusion, because when you look back at the previous week's portion, you wonder, well, wait, what exactly happens here? Because we saw Jacob takes Esau's Bechorah, his birthright, because under sort of tribal and then Jewish law, the oldest son inherits twice as much as the children that come later. He gets a special extra portion. So Jacob he's already sort of tricked Esav, his brother, out of that by giving him some soup, essentially, when he was really, really hungry, which in one sense shows Jacob as being sort of a trickster. On the other hand, it shows Esau as being, a bit of an animal who's willing to do that, unless you take it his claim sort of literally, that he was going to drop dead at that moment, in which case Jacob becomes a monster. So, and generally we don't read it that way, because we don't see Jacob as a monster. So what happens is he takes his birthright, and then there's this blessing, there's this whole other thing that happens. He goes in, his mother has him dress up in fur, so that his blind father, when he feels his arms, won't notice that he's the wrong person, and he'll give him the blessing anyway. And there's all sorts of stuff about this, but let's, going around sort of the issue of Jacob's quote unquote, treachery or trickery or whatever. He's told to do this by his mother, Rivka, who is a Neviah, a prophetess. So she's basically operating on orders from above, right? And then there's something else, which is, if this blessing is passing on the covenant, the Brit, between God and Abraham, if this is passing on a covenant between God and this family, this is sort of a divine act of will. This isn't something you can just sell, right? It's not something that, if I put my hand here or instead of there, I'm going to force God's hand, right? God can still do whatever he wants. He can still say, I'm going to pass on my covenant. I'm going to keep this covenant alive with the son who I think it belongs to. So we see by the fact that God plays along that this is part of his intention, or at least it doesn't go against his intention. So moving past all that, but nonetheless, even if what you're doing is following God's intention, you still have to deal with the practical realities that come from it. It doesn't mean, now that you've inherited God's favor, that you're one side of this covenant with God that later comes to be the covenant between the Jewish people and God. Just because you're one side of this covenant, it doesn't mean your life is going to be easy. In fact, what happens now Jacob has to flee for his life. He runs away from home with nothing, impoverished, back to Haran, back where his mother came from. So he flees back over, but on the way, he's now a refugee with nothing, penniless refugee. He's going to run to his relatives and ask them for sanctuary, and he's going to get it, and he's going to work for them for 20 years, basically as a hired hand, as a shepherd, and eventually marry two of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. But now I want to read actually the first section of the Parsha where he's just leaving Beersheba. The word Vayetze, the name of the Parsha, means and he left. So Jacob left Beersheba, and set out for Haran. He came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, for the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. End quote for the moment. So that stone, traditionally we say this is the foundation stone. This is the same rock of the Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount, the same place where later on the Holy of Holies of both temples would be placed. But again, that's in rabbinic tradition. That's not in the actual text of the Torah. Continues, he had a dream. A stairway was set on the ground, and its top reached to the sky. And angels of God were going up and down on it. And the Lord was standing beside him. And he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying, I will assign to you and to your offspring. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is present in this place, and I did not know it. Shaken, he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the abode of God, Beit El, the house of God in Hebrew, and that is the gateway to heaven. So there's a lot there. This is obviously showing us that essentially passing on the covenant to Jacob, it worked, right? Even though there was trickery involved, whatever, this is sort of God giving his official stamp of approval to what happened in the previous parts of the book. That, yes, I agree, I'm going to pass on my covenant that I made with Abraham, which is almost the same wording, a little tiny bit different, but basically certainly the same covenant in almost exactly the same wording that I gave to Abraham, I'm also giving it to you. It also tells us about a place. So I told you that our sort of midrashic, rabbinic, interpretive story that we tell is that this was actually in Jerusalem. But then there's other opinions that say, wait a second, but he calls the place Beit El. And you can either read that to mean house of God, which Jewishly we would assume means Jerusalem, or you can read Beit El, meaning the actual literal sound of the name refers to a town in what is today Samaria, which is called Beit El. And there was an Arabic town nearby which had a similar name. They kept the name. Anyway, we know basically where it was, and there's a modern Jewish town there. If you come, I'll be happy to take you there. And if we go there, we can see the place where they believe Jacob slept and where the ladder, sort of the foot of the ladder was, so to speak, and where Jacob dreamt. So then there's a question, well, what does that mean? How could it be that it was both here and there? So there's two ways to look at it. One, either, one was literal and one's metaphorical, right? Beit El. Either one of these is true and one of them is false. Or the solution that I really like the best is, well, what does a ladder look like, right? So if you stand in Beit El, in this spot where they think the foot of the ladder was, where Jacob was, you have the foot of the ladder is there in Beit El. And a ladder, it goes on a slant, right? If you look off in the distance, not so far away, is Jerusalem. You can't quite see it from Beit El, but it's just over a couple rows of mountains, not that far away. You can easily imagine, again, this is all metaphysical, this isn't literal, it's a dream, right? It's God making a revelation to Jacob in his sleep. So the practical physics of it aren't exactly relevant. The foot of the ladder is there in Beit El, and the head of the ladder is a couple miles away over Jerusalem, in the heavenly Jerusalem. So the literal place of Jacob's dream is Beit El, the literal town of Beit El. And the metaphorical place of the dream is in the Jerusalem Shalmala, the Jerusalem in the heavens, the sort of the heavenly place that represents Jewish redemption, which is Jerusalem, the place that will ultimately come to represent the place of strongest connection directly between man and God through the temple. So that's all I have to say about it for the moment. Please God will get there soon. The heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem will be united, and the Messiah will come, and we will have peace on earth, and we will all worship God there together, Jews and Gentiles alike, all 70 nations. Please God, it can't come soon enough. And in the meantime, please keep listening, and I'll keep bringing you the news from the Jews of the hills of Judea here in the land of Israel. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to talk to you again next week.